Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Research Fellow for China and National Security at the Heritage Foundation. A reminder to our audience, for whom we are most grateful, viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube or subscribe to hear all our interviews on Apple, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. We welcome you to check out our website and show archive at ChinaDeskPodcast.com. My guest today is Dennis Molinaro, a former national security analyst and policy advisor for the Canadian federal government. An author and academic, he earned his PhD from the University of Toronto in 2015 and studies the history of security, counterintelligence, and foreign interference. His research on wiretapping and the government's use of emergency powers in the 1970s received national media coverage. A frequent media commentator on intelligence and foreign interference issues, he has taught courses on modern espionage, human rights law, and national security at several Canadian universities, including the University of Toronto. He's the author of Under Assault, Interference and Espionage in China's Secret War Against Canada, out November 18th. Well, with that, Dennis, welcome to the China Desk. Let's jump in.
Thanks very much for having me, Steve. I really appreciate it.
Well, it's a pleasure, and we have a cool topic to talk about because espionage and an attack and all that stuff should have people on high alert. But before we get into the meat of our conversation, I warned in the pre-tape, we like our audience to get to know the human beings that are driving our conversation each episode. And no doubt when you were getting up through elementary school and asked what you wanted to do when you grew up, you say, well, one day I'm going to write a book about Chinese espionage.
Yeah. I wish it was that straightforward of a trajectory. I mean, that'd be great. But no, actually, when I was a lot younger, it was a police officer. It was was protecting, serving the community. That was my first go-to, and it was a strange path. I mean, I was all set to actually do that, and then it just started to change in terms of I started more research and more. Really engaged in some of the topics. And actually it was my mother who said to me, you talk an awful lot and you really like to explain things to people like a lot and teach. So you should be a teacher. Like you should really be teaching. And so, all right. So I started to go down that path. And it was really once I was in university, then the research aspect and the writing aspect really took to me. And so then I thought, I've got to take this up a notch. And I went into the PhD, and that's from there when I discovered intelligence history. And once I started down that path, then, that's kind of the trajectory I started to stick to and that I'm on right now.
So you did a good job of following mother's advice. That's admirable. And did you have people in your family that somewhat nudged you along in this career? Not just mom's advice, but did you have people who were in that career path that were kind of enticing models for you?
I didn't actually in teaching. I mean, I was the first in my. I've come from a family of immigrants. Both my parents were immigrants from Europe, and neither one of them went to university. So I was actually the first one going through to university, and decided just to go all the way. But I went into when I went into teaching, and then I found intelligence. It was odd, actually. Funny story was, as I started to even get more into history and down that road of intelligence history, I started to learn a little bit about my own family. And I learned that my grandfather was actually involved in the Polish resistance, secretly fighting Nazis, started working in counterintelligence. My grandmother would never talk about it. Just wouldn't talk about that aspect of his life. But I mean, we even actually, my great grandmother even actually, she sheltered a Jewish boy who was hiding out from the Nazis. So they helped to protect people who were being hunted. So I mean, yeah, kind of strange trajectory that ends up coming right to your doorstep in a way, right?
Well, that's a fantastic background. So that sort of explains how you end up working in federal government service and studying things. Now, I guess there's a couple of questions that come immediately from that. How did that kind of bring you to a particular look at what China was doing in Canada? and then to the pivot out to actual teaching as opposed to working in federal service?
Yeah, so I started teaching like immediately after 2015 when I got my PhD. I started doing some contract teaching and such, and was on the postdoc kind of job market. But as I got more into intelligence history and the field, I thought that really maybe I should actually consider that as a career, because it just spoke to me, right? So I ended up getting involved in Canadian intelligence and the federal government of Canada here. And when I entered that too, it was a big eye opener for me in understanding more about the general threats that we face, right? The West face, and you get more of that obviously in depth look, but for me, it was also important that when I entered intelligence, I did all aspects of the job that I could do. And I had really open-minded supervisors who allowed me to kind of do that. So there was a number of aspects of the job that I got to see and do. And because I felt that, really understanding how the sausage is made, so to speak, made me better as an analyst, because that's what I was. And you get an in-depth view on things that really kind of change your perspective. And then when I left government, I went back into teaching, with an eye towards looking for that tenure track opportunity. And what I noticed quite quickly was the conversations about China in terms of how they were happening in the public realm. And, decades had gone by and in Canada here. And I just continually saw in terms of the histories that were written, the diplomatic histories did not have the intelligence history. And I thought, how can you tell that diplomatic story of where we ended up with China if you don't tell the intelligence side? And I took my cues from Christopher Andrew in Britain, who said that, that intelligence history is an integral part of diplomatic history. And I thought, there's a void here and that needs to be filled.
Well, that's super interesting in terms of thinking about where most of the books that we'll come across and end up in media or academic discourse are almost overwhelmingly by academic researchers that are just looking at media accounts, interviews with maybe some government officials, but then a lot of people and business people who are business executives that maybe get mugged by reality along the way and are giving their version of some of this interaction. But also just the nature of the entities in our country's federal services. They tend to be a little less permissive about being able to tell some of these inner workings or observations based on experience. And yet it really is quite important because as we've talked a lot at the China desk, the government of China uses all of its means of influence to try to affect the world and in some ways its domestic environment. And somehow we leave this critical part out of the conversation a lot. But let's turn to that subject matter because it's right front and center in the book that you have forthcoming. Let's go to Under Assault and talk a little bit about how you came to build the core pieces of this message. My guess is you didn't sit down on one Friday afternoon and it was done the following Monday. There was a bit of arduous work that went into it. Before we get into the meat of the book, talk a little bit about what the journey was in building the book and getting it ready to go.
Sure. The journey was an interesting one. Why I say that? Because on the one hand, this was one of the most difficult books I'd ever written in terms of getting into the source material, trying to get access to the source material. I'm making freedom of information requests to get archival documents. I'm interviewing activists who are worried about their safety. I'm interviewing people who really could face serious repercussions from China for speaking out and for speaking publicly. So I have to take measures to protect them. I'm interviewing people who used to be involved in politics, who can't be identified because, or don't want to be because it could impact them career-wise. And at the same time, it's never been an easier book to write.
Uh-huh.
And I say that because it for me spoke to, this is a North American problem. I mean, the book is largely centered in Canada, but this is really a problem, a threat that crosses borders. And the foreign malign influence space, I mean, it crosses Europe, it crosses Australia, it crosses Canada and the United States. And you'll see frequently within that book, every chapter is Canada, US, because it's impossible to have a conversation and an in-depth look at this subject without getting into that. And the implications, I think, they were serious enough that the public, I think, needed to understand this history, because we need to understand where we're going in the future with China. And we have to understand the threat that they can pose, and right now, frankly, do pose to the West.
Well, certainly is an important down payment on getting solid public policy if you can give a more well-rounded account of what the various forces are that influence both the policy and sort of the electorate's perceptions of how things are going. We've covered a number of different topics and guests over the course of the program, and often the tenure of Xi Jinping is key to sort of somewhat of a pivot point in that narrative. One of the things I found really interesting about your book is that you're tracing a lot of these influences back essentially 5 decades, and it shows a longer arc of what influence operations are, Canada actually being a target of it. I mean, the whole world, whether we like it or not, whether it seems arrogant of Americans to say so, the whole world understands and expects the United States of America to be a target of influence. But Canada has been under a lot of these same influences, maybe because it's sitting atop the United States with a rather permissive border and shared information environment in a lot of ways. But why don't you share, rather than my putting words in your mouth, about this long arc and how that was important in framing what you meant to convey in the book?
Sure. The arc is important because Xi Jinping is one president, and he has amplified United Front work department activities, certainly. But the whole concept goes back to Vladimir Lenin. And it goes back to the PRC using it back in the days of the nationalists and seeking power then. So it's and fighting Japan as well. And so it's not as if these are new concepts. And so really it's important to trace that history so we get that in-depth understanding of what has happened in the past and the significance of how the past has shaped the present. And one of the biggest, I would say, things that I found involved the recognition of China in 1970, because that pivotal moment was when Canada decided that it was going to recognize the PRC government. Previous to that, you had the UK, you had France, some Western, in terms of Western countries, recognize the PRC, but they were pretty ambiguous when it came to Taiwan and the Taiwan question. That changed after Canada's recognition. Now, Canada had devoted a lot of effort in terms of trying to recognize China. They had set up talks to take place in Sweden. And what I found from declassified documents was, and that came to me that to be really an obvious situation or conclusion, was that the recognition of China by Canada was actually a foreign malign influence operation that was waged against Canada. And that's particularly significant. And the reason why it's so significant is because that recognition established the one China policy and the isolation of Taiwan. That recognition became, you could say, the blueprint, the Canadian formula, as it was called, for multiple countries. And that recognition almost reads identical to how the United States ended up recognizing China. In effect, getting the PRC exactly what they wanted in terms of recognizing them and isolating Taiwan. And it shows how a successful influence operation against a close ally can have ramifications for decades.
I think that's a super important concept, but you've got a few different concepts in there that I think are worthy of unpacking. One is the core message that I think comes through loud and clear and through the entire book is that what happens in Canada doesn't stay in Canada. And in some ways, that's by intent on the PRC end of it. And so that's one reason why these influence operations in Canada actually do align with America's national interests too, in trying to understand and maybe thwart some of these influence operations. But let's take a step back from that and have you unpack a little bit. You say that the diplomatic normalization process with Canada was, in fact, one of these foreign influence operations. What is a foreign influence operation in the work of your book?
So I would say that when it comes, let's use the recognition example as a case study, you could say. So in that particular situation, what you have is this individual by the name of Paul Lin. And Paul Lin is an academic who's in BC, he's teaching at McGill University. And he basically goes on this large speaking tour across Canada. He goes across Europe even. He's meeting influential business leaders. He's meeting all kinds of elites within society. And what I learned from those documents was that the RCMP security services, who was doing intelligence here at the time, they discovered that he was an agent of influence, as they put it, and working for the CCP, the Communist Party of China, right? And so that becomes majorly significant, but it's also what also ends up happening is he is secretly trying to meet officials involved in the talks. He's seen leaving the a hotel where the PRC ambassador involved in the talks was also staying. Reporters were secretly trying to warn the Canadian government that they believed he was trying to influence Pierre Trudeau. And this individual ends up going to the United States, and in his memoir states that Kissinger's people essentially reach out to him to arrange for the first visit when Nixon visits China. So he starts to get involved in the recognition, in terms of bolstering support for recognition of the PRC within the United States. So to answer your question, an influence operation, then, the way you can see it formulate is that it takes the form of these influential individuals essentially getting turned or co-opted by the PRC, and then pushing the PRC's interests as if they were their own and trying to influence others to follow their lead.
Yeah, I think in current discourse in the American press and maybe international press, this concept of elite capture is one of the elements. That could be a government official who is on the receiving end of maybe uncouth approaches of money or other kinds of comfort. Or it could be, as you were saying, one of these people who becomes an influencer. And the CCP has been very, very good. It's not just the Chinese Communist Party. Lots of foreign intelligence services would like to have people who are citizens and of some stature or influence in the target country be the conveyors of the message or policy they're peddling. And so this anecdote about the diplomatic recognition, I think that it resonates so clearly with what people are talking about now. I think you might be among the first to talk in greater detail of exactly how this piece of working toward Canada's change of recognition and the general international shift focusing on isolation of Taiwan, that I think is really important part of the broader narrative that I don't think has gotten enough attention. And then to have a personal tie of an individual that was central to conveying that narrative in Canada and then into the United States. I think that's a really, really interesting and important part of the diplomatic and intelligence history that you were getting after that I don't think is talked about very much in American circles. So thank you for that important part of the work. I think there's another part of your book theme that resonates very, very clearly with other conversations we've had, but it's one we haven't really heard the Canadian version of that well, and it's where a lot of Canadian leaders, what you say, have seen only what they want to see in China. And sort of raises the question of why is this so? Obviously, especially with the passage of decades of time, it's one thing when you're a leader going in the great cultural revolution and you're having limited access to China and you're drawing conclusions. It's in the middle of the Cold War, et cetera, et cetera. But now we're many decades past all of that post-Cold War internet information revolution, financial crises, all of these things. And yet there are still people who see only what they want to see. And arguably, the current and most recent past Canadian government would fall into that categorization from my humble point of view. But share with us what you meant by weaving that part of the topic into your work.
Yeah, it's a good point, and it's this is the central thread that runs through the book. There's two threads. There's the Michael Kinsley quotation, right, where the scandal isn't what's legal illegal. The scandal is what's legal.
Yeah,
and alongside that, belief in seeing, right, that and that idea that people, at least in terms of government that I saw from doing interviews and collecting the resources for the book and doing all this digging in the archives and what have you, was that it really wouldn't have made a difference with what intelligence was put in front of people over the years, because they continued to believe in a version of China that was the one that was agreeable to them, rather than the one that actually existed. And I think that's something also that Americans faced as well. I mean, there's that period, especially right in the 90s, where there's that FOMO, that fear of missing out, where everyone's running into China to do business with China, and everyone's trying to think that China is that's the next best place where they're going to get rich and they're gonna whatever in terms of success. And what we see continually is that China uses that and used it to its advantage to entice people, to lure people, whether it's business or academia or government, and continually sell this version or this view of itself that wasn't in line with the reality, which was actually more geared towards supplanting Western hegemony, to challenging the West, to challenging the United States, using Canada to help itself do that. And Canada sometimes in this, what I saw in this idea of wanting to be independent of the US and wanting to carve its own destiny, sometimes I felt looked to China as an option to help it do that. And it got taken advantage of. And I think in the current times, it's so important because, again, there's this direction or effort of wanting to do more business with China or form some type of strategic partnership. And to me, it's just it's a Faustian bargain. This is something that could potentially backfire in a very bad way.
Well, it's certainly a lot of what you've found that resonates with my impressions of the American experience, both in policymaking and in terms of the yearning to see what we hope would be the outcomes. A lot of times that's chalked up to the missionary impulse and seeing everyone as a potential convert, or the commercial impulse of seeing everyone as a potential customer. And those, I think, are two major arteries of the willful blindness in terms of what reality is in China. But there's another part of your work and the message of your book that is also super important for what we have been talking about and seeing written in the United States. And that's the realities of what the CCP is doing in our own countries. It's one thing to talk about the foreign policy challenge, but if you're going to look comprehensively at what the reality is, it's what are they doing in their own country that affects us. But all along, in truth, they've been doing a lot in our own countries. But in recent years, we now seem to have maybe rolled the sunshades back a little bit and are willing to see with our own eyes a little more clearly what's happening. So maybe share that part of your book's message about what the realities are of what the CCP influences have been in Canada itself.
Sure, and again, like these influences, what's interesting again is as I wrote this, I continually found the same occurrences happening in the United States. And why is that? It's because the PRC playbook was honed and perfected at home against Taiwan, against Hong Kong, against Tibet, against the Uyghurs. And then it gets exported. And it's exported to the West, to Australia, to the UK, to the United States, to Canada. And so every chapter of the book, there's discussion of what's happening in America and also happening within Canada. And so what you see is a multifaceted threat. You see, and really I would say this is made possible because for a long time, Russia was an easy enemy. It was an easy enemy to see. The Cold War, the Soviet Union was a closed economic system, communism. Not the case with China. When we expanded those markets and that business opportunity investment, Canada did the same as the United States. All of a sudden now, it's a lot harder for people to call them an adversary. You have multitude of partnerships, and these are exploited. These are vectors of influence. So you see it in the cyber realm. You see it in terms of trying to outright do theft of technology or what have you. But that's also combined with a human intelligence element. I mean, there's the case of Sue Bin in the book where there's a human actor that's helping the hackers the whole time. Steal technology, in this case from the United States, but it was coming from Canada as well, the assistance. You see influence of elites where there's attempts to wine and dine officials. There's UFWD trying to engage in influence activities within Canada. You see in terms of, and along that same avenue, transnational repression, going after dissidents, people who speak out, looking for people who are quote unquote economic fugitives as part of Operation Fox Hunt, when some of the time it's just, as most of the time, it's actually just to crack down on dissidents. And so there's all these different avenues and also research partnerships, looking for partnerships with academics willing to partner with China to get their research funded and taken up, and then their IP gets taken, swiped. And so these issues occur all throughout the book. And so that's a number of the different avenues that foreign malign influence takes.
Well, one of the challenges that we face oftentimes when trying to write comment about these malign influences within our own country is the accusation of xenophobia.
Sure.
I know from even just cursory tracking of what some of the commentary has been within Canada that the race card gets played quite a lot when people are trying to push back on any scrutiny of undue influence coming from the People's Republic of China. What's been your experience on trying to investigate about this and now publish about this subject, and the sort of red flag that gets thrown has to do with the accusation of xenophobia?
Yeah, I haven't experienced it directly as of yet, but in terms of witnessing it around the conversations, absolutely. I mean, it comes up repeatedly. It comes up where you'll see attempts by people to try to frame this in that context. And really, it's, that anybody would buy that angle is unfortunate. And the reason I say that is because it is, primarily people within Canadian, Chinese American communities that are the ones that are primarily victimized by the CCP, right? They're the ones that have to face and deal with this, sometimes more directly than others. And so, the idea that it's racist, like those are the people that are speaking out, saying and looking for Western governments to assist them in countering the CCP because of what they face. Because you shouldn't have to deal with authoritarian transnational repression when you're living in a free country and you fled to escape it. You should be protected from that, and you should feel safe within a free Western nation from the reach of an authoritarian country.
Well, that's a perfect conclusion to punctuate the conversation. We could literally go on for another entire episode, and hopefully you'll agree to come back, and we might continue the conversation for another episode, maybe after we get a sense of the sweeping book sales that cross Canada and America upon release of your book. But as we wind down, Dennis, why don't you share any parting thoughts and remind the audience where they can go to get maybe an advanced copy of your book?
Well, I just think that I appreciate you having me, Steve. And this is one of the things that I think that, I believe that the book is something that is so important for people to read and understand. So they really know where the West has been when it comes to China, so they can properly set the course for where it needs to go. And that means including security along with diplomacy, because just like China has its interests, we have our own, and we need to protect those. Under Assault goes on sale November 18th. So all well-known booksellers, big and small, and I appreciate the support.
Well, Dennis, we want to thank you. And for our audience, if you've enjoyed today's China Desk conversation, please tell your friends, consider subscribing, and give a visit to ChinaDeskPodcast.com. Thank you for joining. A special thank you to Dennis Molinaro for sharing his perspective. Until next time, I'm Steve Yates, your host here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.